Hi there, John Wilkinson again, and History Made Easier. In this presentation, I'm going to use wartime posters to talk about the experiences of British citizens on the home front. The experience of war for the Brits was nothing like as bad as those in the army fighting on the different fronts, nor was it as bad as that experienced by German civilians. But nevertheless, you and I would not have wanted to experience it. And something I'd like you to think about as we go through this presentation. All the families on the home front would be worrying about sons or wives or fathers fighting in Belgium, France, at sea, or any of the other different fronts. And that was an emotional impact that I think would just simply must have been tough to bear. Now, the Defence of the Realm Act, or DORA as it was known, was passed just 3 days after Britain declared war. DORA curtailed a lot of civil rights, and it gave the government powers to control workforces. For example, in order to increase production in the armaments factories without increasing costs. It extended the working day and controlled wage levels, keeping them as low as possible, and it made strikes illegal. In 1916, British summertime was introduced so as to maximise daylight and so give more working hours on farms. It even restricted the times that pubs could open and weakened the strength of alcoholic drinks. DORA made it an offence to talk about military matters in public or to spread rumours about the war. It also censored newspapers and even letters sent to and from the fronts. Foreigners were required to register, and their free movement was restricted to daylight hours, and some were even interned, that is, placed in camps for the duration of the war. Factories that produced non-essential goods were either converted to war production or else closed down, and their workforces moved to jobs that were essential to the war effort. Women joined the workforce too. Indeed, it was critical to the war effort that they did. At the very beginning of the war, around 120,000 women volunteered to undertake national service, as the government called it. And by the end of the war, some 2 million women had taken up the call. Some 400,000 women left their traditional jobs in domestic service to do so, and few would return to domestic service after the war, an important change in society. They worked in the civil service, the textile industry, transport, the munitions factories, and in agriculture. An indication of how important they were to the production of munitions is that by mid-1917, it is thought that some 80% of munitions were being produced by women. The women in the munitions factories became known as canaries, as the TNT used in explosives caused their skin and hair to turn yellow. There were even reports of babies being born yellow. Usually the effect faded away with time, but that such work came at a price is shown by the number of women who suffered ill health as a result of working with TNT. Indeed, it's thought that as many as 100 deaths were caused by overexposure to TNT. Deaths were also caused by explosions in munitions factories, around 600 in total, including casualties in neighbouring houses. In January 1917, for example, an explosion in a factory near London resulted in 73 deaths and a further 400 injured. Food production was vitally important, and more than 250,000 women also worked on farms, the famous Women's Land Army. Women in industry as well as agriculture often worked away from home, and in the morality of the early 19th century, this was a real concern, and ways were sought to protect women, for example, providing hostels for them to live in. So, an indication of just some of the many different roles taken up by women, including working in the police force for the first time, and for the Army and the Navy. Women worked in nursing, both on the home front and behind the lines, and in supporting roles ranging from cleaners and cooks to drivers. They also supported the military in a range of jobs, from clerical work to working as mechanics. They also worked in a range of jobs for the Navy as cleaners and cooks, but also in the offices and as carpenters, electricians and welders, repairing ships, as drivers and as signallers and radar operators. Free a man for service was a recruitment slogan used. In total, around 80,000 women supported the military in one way or another, on the home front mostly, but also in Belgium and France. To add a light note amidst the misery of war, as professional football was brought to a halt, women's football took off. The teams were mostly linked to munitions factories, and some games were played before crowds larger than some Premier League games today. The money charged at the gate would go to charities, for example, support for wounded soldiers. But the pressure to resort to traditional gender roles and the belief that football was harmful to women led the British FA to ban games on FA-affiliated grounds, which meant almost all grounds that could hold spectators. And therefore, after the war, women's football struggled to maintain its popularity until recently. Voluntary rationing began in February 1917 and aimed at reducing consumption of four basics: sugar, potatoes, bread, and meat. It had some effect, but by 1918, imposed rationing proved necessary. And people, as we have seen, were encouraged to grow their own vegetables, and unused land was also put to use growing vegetables. Men, of course, also made important contributions to the home front, the likes of farmers, coal miners, and shipbuilders, and men too old to fight worked in the factories, and making small but important contributions to food production. And of course, the war had to be paid for, and Britain, like other countries, encouraged its citizens to buy war bonds, essentially loans to the government that would be paid back in better times. And so that's my brief overview of life on the home front in Britain. I hope you found it interesting. As always, I remind you to check out my History Made Easier website, and as always, I thank you. Cheers.